continue. So as we mentioned, vulnerability is not only a technical term. We need to think about a lot of aspects here. And of course, during our class, we will discuss a lot about technical and non-technical vulnerabilities as well. So when we talk about technical vulnerabilities, we find that each vulnerability have a kind of scoring. And this scoring help us to determine what could be the possible impact of a certain vulnerability. One of these scoring methods is a criteria or a parameter called Common Vulnerability Scoring System, or CVSS. And the CVSS is a kind of assessment that, based on it, we can define if a certain vulnerability related to a system is high or medium or low. What is the key differentiation between this, or what are the, let's say, the measures or the criteria that, based on this, we can define a vulnerability as a high? Is that the vulnerability can be easily exploited, and it can be exploited from remote users, which means if this vulnerability, for example, is related to a website, anyone can reach this website from his country, wherever he live at. He would be able to exploit it, and there is a kind of way to exploit this vulnerability. For vulnerability that is categorized as medium, it is a vulnerability that is not remotely exploitable. We cannot exploit it from remote. We need like a local access, and the technique or the way to exploit this vulnerability is somehow harder. For a low vulnerability, that means this vulnerability cannot be immediately exploited. For vulnerability categorized as high, we can find it score between 7 to 10. And of course, each vulnerability will also have a kind of information about which factor of CIA does it impact. Can you give me like a brief overview about what is the CIA? Again, I'm just re-asking you to ensure everything is good. Yeah, and when assess a particular vulnerability, we check what does this vulnerability affect in the first place. Does it have, or does it has an effect? Does it have? I believe this is the right way to say it. Does it have an effect of confidentiality only, or does it affect only availability? For some kind of vulnerability, once we exploit it, we only make system irresponsive or does not respond to further requests. So this kind of vulnerability, for example, could lead to system unavailability. So it affect or impact only the availability. For other vulnerability, it can impact the confidentiality. So can somebody of you give me a practical example for a vulnerability that was known in IT, and he personally participated in patching of such a vulnerability? I know most of all of you are from the IT support, so you are dealing with day-to-day issues of end users, and of course you could be participated in security patching or something like this. So does anybody of you know a particular vulnerability happened recently, or we don't have this knowledge yet? We heard about, we were aware about, and we participated in patching for it. We somehow received a notification from security department. Yeah. Yeah. So why? And of course, we did a kind of patching after the ransomware attack, right? Okay. So to make it clear, ransomware is a kind of virus that encrypt data on user's desktop. The ransomware will not be able to reach your systems unless you have a door opened that allowed this ransomware to reach your network. So vulnerability is like the doorway that allow different malicious codes to enter your network. So in fact, to be impacted by this ransomware, you could have a vulnerability in place. And this vulnerability was known by the threat actor, the one who delivered this vulnerability to you. Vulnerability could be delivered due to phishing email, and this is a vulnerability on the human factor. Could be delivered because of unpatched system, and this is related to technical factor, and all of this sort of stuff. So in order to be a proactive in cybersecurity, you need to keep information about what are the recent vulnerabilities that are on the stage. We are now on Monday, 13th of June. Tomorrow is the second Tuesday in June, I believe. It is the second Tuesday. And in the second Tuesday of every month, we have what is called Microsoft Patch Tuesday. Microsoft Patch Tuesday, Microsoft select like the second patch of every month to release the security updates related to Microsoft products. Not only Microsoft, but also we have organizations such as Adobe, such as Oracle. All of these organizations select to release their security patches and security updates in next or in the second Tuesday of every month, which will be tomorrow. And expect by the end of this day or by tomorrow a lot of news about Microsoft recent patched vulnerabilities. In security patches, or patches in general, we have two reasons for releasing patches. The first reason is to maybe close a security vulnerability in place. Second reason could be to introduce a new feature or a new capability. But for like 90% of patches that is being released every month, most of patches have security objective to close some of vulnerabilities that are in place. So Patch Tuesday is usually the second Tuesday of every month, and Microsoft in Patch Tuesday release what are the new patches that has been released and what are the vulnerabilities that were already in place. By the way, for some kind of vulnerability, they may exist, but we are not aware about it. But Microsoft know about the existence of this vulnerability. That's why when they release a patch for it, they announce to the public audience that we are aware that we have a vulnerability, and please take this patch or take this software in order to close it or install it in your system, and by installing it, you will close this vulnerability. But we have some kind of vulnerability that Microsoft might not know about it. And in this case, this is known as a zero-day vulnerability. Zero-day vulnerability means a vulnerability that could not be known by Microsoft, and as a result, we don't have a patch or a security update that can close this vulnerability. So this kind of vulnerability could be exploitable, and we could not have a proper control or a proper security control against it until Microsoft or the vendor that is managing this product or this software will release a patch to address it. Clear? So in order to stay updated with what are the recent vulnerability and how to rank this vulnerability, we have an interesting website that is called Cve Trends, and it is managed by a security service provider called CrowdStrike. CrowdStrike is one of famous endpoint protection and antivirus vendors, so how for many years. And in Cve Trends website, they are categorizing what are the well-known vulnerabilities during the time we are speaking now. For example, the most known or most used vulnerability now right now is categorized as CVE 2022-26134. But this vulnerability, as it is still new because it released in 2022 or announced this year, this vulnerability is still does not have a scoring based on the CVSS, which we were talking about. This vulnerability, for example, is still under assessment to understand how it is known. And how ranking here work by checking Twitter, checking news, checking how many people are searching for this name of CVE, and then it can give you like tweets about what this vulnerability is about. So from the perspective, or as I can read here, this vulnerability exists in a software called Atlassian. Atlassian is a software that manage a product or vendor that create a product called Jira. Do you are familiar with Jira software? Yeah, Jira is like a software management or a version control system that is used by developers. Okay, so in Jira Cloud version, they have a kind, or I believe in on-prem version of Jira, they have like a vulnerability in Jira, and this vulnerability allow unauthenticated users to create or conduct a remote code execution attack. So if we are in charge of information security in our organization, we can open the link that is talking about this specific vulnerability and start to read what is the effect of this vulnerability. Okay, this vulnerability exists, in example, in software version X. So I will check if I use this affected version in my place. If I use it, I should inform the IT security team to do the risk assessment and to do the patching. As I mentioned earlier, you got a ransomware attack. So how ransomware attack happened or reached your organization? Because you may have a vulnerability in software such as Jira. And by the existence of this vulnerability, the ransomware hackers or threat actors can use this vulnerability to deliver ransomware attack to your organization. Can you relate vulnerability in Jira with ransomware attack? Could you relate what is the relation between both of these together? It's hard to be guessed, right? What could be the impact of a vulnerability on Jira in relation to ransomware attacks that affect my users? Could you give a relation here between these two different incidents or different terms? Yeah, they get, hackers will manage to access the Jira software first because we have a vulnerability here in Jira. Okay? As a result, for attacking the Jira software, we can send the instruction to the Jira server. And here I'm not specifically talking about Jira itself. I'm talking about any vulnerable product, any vulnerable server that could be published online, reachable from public users, and has a vulnerability. Okay? You are keeping up with me? So the hacker can exploit this vulnerability, and by exploit this vulnerability, he instructs the server to initiate a command from the server command line interface. This command simply requests a malicious or the ransomware source code from another online file share server or online server that hosts this ransomware. Okay? So usually, yeah, yeah, right, yeah, repository that hosts the ransomware code downloaded to Jira, And if we don't have a segmentation inside the network, I believe we are familiar with the concept of VLANs, right? Virtual Local Area Networks. In VLANs, we place servers in a zone. We place public servers or servers that are published online in what is called DMZ. Is that correct? And so on. The reason why for this, that in case Jira got infected, it will not be able to reach whole of the network. But if Jira can access the whole of the network, if the ransomware reaches the Jira server, he can use this server as a base to conduct the attack on the rest of the network and distribute the malware on the rest of network devices. If the attack managed, or if this exploit was impacting servers such as Microsoft Exchange server, which may be the main email service in many organizations that are still working on-prem, the Exchange server will be reachable by all of the users inside the organization. So this would make the situation more worse. And even VLANs will not be able to control such attack. If the attack was impacting file share server, this could be also has a more negative impact because all users in the organizations will be able to reach the server as well. So I can share with you this link in case you need to read more about this. And by the way, back again to this website, you will find another type of vulnerabilities. And as you can see, this one is categorized as CVSS score of what? 9.8. The maximum score of the CVSS score is 10. So by having a vulnerability ranked as 9.8, that means this vulnerability is very easy to be exploited. Its impact on confidentiality, integrity, availability is very high. And also it can be exploited from anybody can reach this system. And this vulnerability impacting, I believe we have a lot of Chinese tweets in this vulnerability, but this vulnerability, I cannot get what is the product that this vulnerability is impacted with. But in case I need to know more, I can simply go to this URL, for example, which is published by the National Vulnerability Database, which is managed by NIST. And the NIST is like an organization, federal organization that is concerned about cybersecurity. And then I can go to the details about the link of this vulnerability. And as you can see here, we have a link here, and this link is marked as what? And that exploit is a way to take benefit or make use of this vulnerability. So exploit is a software code that is written using a specific programming language. Could be Python, could be Ruby. All of these are a programming language. And by using this exploit, if I know a website that is impacted by this vulnerability, I can take this exploit and try to test it on this website. We heard about the term white hat hacker or ethical hacker, right? What does the ethical hacker do in reality? He starts in scanning your own network. Of course, after gaining your consent and gaining your agreement to do so, because ethical hacking is permitted action. So he starts in scanning, and then he discovers that you have a system that is impacted by this particular CVE. Then he will try to look for a code or exploit to impact or exploit this specific vulnerability. And by the way, we have a lot of ways to search for exploits. One of these ways, for example, is to use a website called exploits.db. And exploits.db is like a search engine for what are the current vulnerable softwares and what is the exploit code that can help us in exploiting this vulnerable software. Okay? But of course, not every vulnerability on the web, we can find an exploit code available for it. Because for some type of vulnerabilities, we can find their exploits are sold or are sold on the deep web with huge amount of money. could reach few thousand dollars or thousand US dollars in reality. Okay, so penetration tester or ethical hacker or white hat hacker will bring this exploit code and will try to exploit your system. And if he managed to exploit your system by this exploit, he will just take a screenshot to prove that he was able to exploit your system, and will send you a report include how he attacked or she attacked your system and what was the steps and what is the solution to mitigate against this attack by instructing you to go to this URL and download this patch and apply it. Okay? Okay, although this vulnerability is released in 2020, why it is still appearing in the trending CVEs right now? It should be released from 2 years ago. So why it is still available online here? Or appear as a trend? What do we mean by trend is that a lot of people are talking about it right now. Why this could happen? That's correct and that's right. In case of ransomware, and especially back to 2017, I believe, we have a huge ransomware attack called WannaCry. WannaCry was a massive ransomware attack that impacted a huge organizations. One of these organizations, by the way, was Mersec. And Mersec was impacted by a few days out of service, which caused like 240 million US dollar as a losses due to the system outage for just a few days. And the reason why for Mersec attack is Microsoft released a security patch for Exchange Server. If you are familiar with Exchange Server, it is okay. If not, just let me know to explain it. By the way, Exchange Server, although the patch was released on March, the system administrators didn't patch their system until May. And in the May, hackers got enough time to understand and study this vulnerability and develop exploit that can attack this vulnerability. And they used this exploit to attack this vulnerability, send a remote code execution, allowed the impacted server to request the ransomware from external website, downloaded it inside the affected network, and then distributed the ransomware across all devices in the network. So we still have a lot of vulnerabilities that, although we have patches for it, but a lot of people still didn't consider it at all. Clear? Okay, so I hope you are enjoying, and information that we are discussing is clear enough and simple enough, and you are all understanding it.